Hello YouTubers, Alaska Prepper here. I found an article that is pretty interesting. However, it's pretty long, so I'm going to try to get through it. And I'm also going to leave the link for this article so that you guys can read it if you would like to. Well, the name of the article is "What Happens If All the World Stop Using the US Dollar as a Trading Currency?" What would happen? But why would this happen also? That's an underlying question, is why would this happen? Why would the world stop using the US dollar as a trading currency? So I asked myself this question, and what I came up with is this. Let's say that the Alaska Prepper built a toll road in your county where you live, and you had to use that toll road to get from point A to point B. But soon after the toll road was open, I started telling you, hey, listen, in order for you to use this toll road, you're going to have to pay me this much. And you agreed, and everyone around there agreed to pay. And they continued to use it. And I justified it by saying, well, I need, some revenue in order to, keep the road up, in order to hire people to man the toll booths, etc. Okay, and that sounds kind of fair because I expended the capital, and energy needed to put up the road to make your life better. Okay, because now your life is a little bit better because you get to get from point A to point B a lot faster and safer than you did before. Okay, but let's say that not only did I continue to raise the toll prices, but now I was putting restrictions on what you could do in your own household before you can use my toll road. And eventually, I'm putting so many restrictions on you, on what you can do, that it is becoming very burdensome for you to use this toll road. Because you know that in order for you to be able to use it, you have to conform to my will. So what would you do if these restrictions that I kept putting on you got to a place where you had to make a decision on whether it was even worth using my toll road? Well, eventually you would start looking for other ways to get from point A to point B. And even if it meant taking the back roads, which would take you longer to get to point B, eventually that's what you're going to start doing, because the value of using the toll road is no longer there because of all of the other restrictions that you have to conform with. So eventually it's a no-sum game. But once it turns from a no-sum game to where you're not even gaining an advantage by using this toll road as you were in the beginning, now it's costing you. Now it's a negative net worth to you to use this toll road. Now you're going to start looking for a different way to get from point A to point B. And eventually everyone else in that county where that toll road exists will start using a different way to get from point A to point B and not use the toll road. And in this case, the toll road is the US. The owner of the toll road is the US government. And the users of the toll road are other countries. All right? And what is the toll road? The SWIFT system. The SWIFT system, in addition to the military, is one of the things that the U.S. uses to twist other countries' arms. All right? The restrictions that the U.S. uses, I would call sanctions. It's what the U.S. uses to twist the arm of other countries into conforming to use the SWIFT system. And now other countries are starting to find another way to get around that toll road and not have to use it. So I'm not sure if that made sense. But eventually, ladies and gentlemen, when a system like this that becomes so powerful and so oppressive, right, eventually there is a term used that's called the jig is up. Okay, eventually the jig will be up. And what does that mean? Well, let's see if we can close this out. I'm not sure if you've heard that before. The jig is up. It is used to say that a dishonest plan or activity has been discovered and will not be allowed to continue. How long will it take before everyone stops using the toll road? I honestly couldn't tell you. But eventually, most people will stop using it unless it benefits them. You have to understand, there's two sides of a transaction. A transaction has two sides. It has a seller and a buyer. And if there are no buyers, then the seller loses all of his or her power. So in the system that we have now, the seller is the U.S. We are the net exporter of inflation around the entire world. And what is inflation? It's the creation of U.S. dollars. There is more U.S. dollars around the world in reserves and being used, in trade than there is here in the United States. So what would happen if the world stops using, or most of the world stops using the US dollar? Think about it. If you have twice as many US dollars in the US, what's going to happen to the price of goods? The price of everything. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and start this article. So the title is, what happens if all the world stopped using the US dollar as a trading currency? One way to look at this is to consider the dollar itself as the main export of the US. After all, it is the most worldwide accepted and acquired made in the USA good. Proof of this are around 44% of all international payments are made in dollars. 64% of all global reserves are in US dollars, while 44% of all international payments are made in dollars. And that has dropped, ladies and gentlemen. And I think this article is almost a year old. It's a year old. And it's 44%. It's probably lower than that now. And let's see, 65% of all US dollar bills. Listen to this. 65% of all US dollar bills are outside the US. This gives the US a huge economic and political advantage. If most of the world changes to other currencies, there would be no consequences both for the US and internationally. There would be consequences. Domestically, the US dollar's role in global economy has allowed to maintain low interest rates for US consumers, which has certainly helped to build an economy heavily dependent on debt. And ladies and gentlemen, the way this system was designed, this is how I feel, right? This is what I believe. The way that this system was designed here in the US, It was made so that we would stay in debt for the rest of our lives, so that we would always be in debt. Even if you're debt free, you still have debt. Okay, there's that tax bill that comes at the end of every year, or that tax bill that comes every year for you to be able to stay living where you're living. Okay, even if your house is paid off. Since U.S. bonds are one of the main forms that international reserves take, basically there are countries interested in buying U.S. debt, major foreign holders of treasury securities, and this helps to maintain low interest rates down the economic chain. In fact, one of the main reasons why the U.S. can combine low taxation with a very expensive government, which has the second largest budget after China's government, which finances mostly from other forms of revenue, is simply because it is very easy to sell U.S. Treasury bonds, even for paying for costly wars, nearly $5 trillion and counting. It also provides exceptional tools to the U.S. when dealing with self-caused crises, even those that reach global proportions like the financial crisis of 2007 and 8. If the dollar were not the main global currency, the U.S. would have to buy a foreign currency to trade, like most of the world does now, which in practice implies to acquire also foreign debt, instead of using its own currency. If this happens, this will eliminate also several of the greatest advantages of the U.S. in trading, not only because right now its government can decide the policies that directly affect the main currency for trading, which is the currency in which most national reserves are as well, but also because it gives outstanding commercial advantages to the U.S. Obviously, it facilitates both U.S. exports and imports, making the process of trading much more easier for U.S. companies and for foreign companies, since the latter have to acquire or sell U.S. currency and plan accordingly. But the advantages go well beyond the companies themselves. Many foreign governments are interested in having trade relationships with the U.S., not only for the goods and services themselves, but because in that way they will receive U.S. dollars for trading with other countries in the easiest way possible. So a huge advantage that the U.S. has is that it prints dollars, and the dollar is the reserve currency. In order for us to be able to trade with other countries, we theoretically don't have to produce anything except U.S. dollars. All right? Because we can have as many U.S. dollars in reserves as we want just by printing them. Whereas another country actually has to produce something of value in order to trade it for U.S. dollars, so that they can then use those reserves to purchase other things from other countries, since the U.S. dollar is what is used for international trade. So you see what a scam that is? What a scam it is that one country has to actually produce something of value to receive monopoly money in order for them to be able to import something that they need from a different country, because the vehicle that has to be used for trade, you know, as a world reserve currency, is the US dollar. This gives also an additional advantage to the US as the main market on earth, because many more countries are interested in making sacrifices to enter into its market. But also, since trading is a two-way relationship, it also gives advantages to U.S. exports, and it also gives political advantages to the U.S. because less players are willing to offend the owner of the ball that everyone is using to play, so to speak. But this leads to another point. If the dollar is replaced, the consequences will be felt internationally, because the dollar is on the foundation of the current international system itself, which in turn would significantly decrease the U.S. political clout globally. It is very important to understand that the dollar is the main currency for trading, not because the U.S. GDP is the biggest on earth. It is true that the U.S. GDP is 23% of the world GDP, but in 1960, when the U.S. was still the only industrial country that had not been affected negatively by World War II, the U.S. GDP was 40% of the world's GDP. Now both China and the EU have larger economies than the U.S. in terms of gross domestic purchasing power, which is a more serious measure for competitiveness because it represents how many dollars you have, but it does not represent how many dollars you have, but how many things you can afford to buy and make with these dollars. Excuse me. A way to understand this is by asking who is economically more solid between two men. One earns $2,000 per month, while the other earns $1,500. But the first is living in an area where the rent costs $1,600, which means he has $400 left for all other expenses, while the second lives in an area where the same apartment costs $800, which means he has $700 for all other expenses, and most of these also cost less than they cost in the first area. So why the U.S. currency keeps its role as a main global currency? So why the U.S. keeps its role as a main global currency? Basically because it was planned like that from the beginning of the current international system itself. So it is mainly a legacy from a time when, toward the end of the first half of the 20th century, the U.S. played the main role in the development of a system of alliances and institutions created when all industrial countries but the U.S. were struggling to rebuild their economies after the Second World War. Since the U.S. was the only large country in better economic shape after the war than it was before it, basically doubling its real GDP during the 40s, which also helps to explain why most Western and Asian countries are more reluctant to be in the roulette of military solutions than the U.S. U.S. planners, economists, and diplomats had an exceptional clout in the development of this new global system. I mean, not in vain UN headquarters are in New York since 1952. It was also that epoch when the U.S. became the leader of the so-called free world. One example among many possible others after the creation of the Bretton Woods system, the International Monetary Fund was founded in 1945 to rebuild the international payment system. Since the U.S. currency played a special role from the beginning, the U.S. has kept this advantage until now. Why is the dollar still the reserve currency of the world? First, as the central bank of the world, it was pegged to gold. First, as the central currency of the world, it was pegged to gold from that moment until the Nixon shock. As we all know, back in 1971, August 15th, Richard Nixon decoupled the dollar from the gold. And when he did that, he pretty much gave 100% control of our currency to the banks, because there was no measure to the dollar anymore. There was no measure at all to the dollar, okay, because he decoupled it. Later, it has been linked to the most essential contemporary commodity, oil, and he's talking about the petrodollar right here. When it began to be officially quoted in U.S. dollars after the OPEC Accords of the early 70s, and that occurred around 73, when Nixon sent, I forget his name, he's really old now, but he's still alive. He sent his Secretary of State, I believe it was, I keep forgetting his name, but he sent him over to Saudi Arabia to talk to the king and convince them to convince OPEC to sell all their oil. Harry Kissinger went down to Saudi Arabia and convinced the Saudi king to convince OPEC to sell all of their oil in dollars. All right. Now that he convinced them, now every nation in the world that did business with Saudi Arabia or any of the OPEC nations had to have dollars in reserves if they wanted to purchase oil from them. That was the birth of the petrodollar. Okay. As it happens with any widely used system, once the system was in place and it was used by most of the customers, it became very difficult to replace. And during the last 70 years, other countries have accepted this fact. But each time, more of them are less enthusiastic because they know they are financing a system increasingly unbalanced, which doesn't fulfill anymore its most important purpose: provide stability to global wealth. And here, ladies and gentlemen, is a very nice chart. All right, this is 1970, when the dollar was decoupled, or it was technically done in 71, but they're just showing you a chart of the value of the dollar from 1970 till today. And as you can see here, in 1970, it was very nice. It was very big, and it had its ups and downs, and then it took a really jump up here. Why did it jump up so high right here? This was around the mid 80s. That was during a time where inflation was pretty high, but I remember that in that time, somewhere around there, Ronald Reagan, I think, was president. I think he had a year or two without taxes, where he didn't tax anyone. And I could be wrong. But I think that was one of the reasons for this right here. But this is the value of the dollar. But what this chart is showing you is what a lot of people won't see is like, oh wow, but look at that. You know, that's really high. We're not that bad. But it's not where we're at. It's the trend. Look at the trend. The trend is downward. The trend is a downward trend. This black line is the mean. And ever since the system was decoupled from Bretton Woods, the mean has been on a downtrend. Okay? So that's what is interesting about that chart to me. US dollar index, 1970 to 2017. Okay, so this goes back to 2017. It is important to consider that no system is built to last forever. So to predict long-term currency behavior, understanding history and global politics is as essential as understanding economy. If you look attentively without being distracted by the multiple surges, bubbles, and foreign defaults and crises patterns between the strength of the US dollar and international trust in the capability of US leadership becomes obvious. Particularly after the end of the Cold War in the early 90s, currency markets always punish lack of trust. And and it always rewards trust, not only economically but also politically. And like it happens with infidelity in many couples, regaining again total trust is something that can be elusive and can take a lot of effort. After just one mistake, sadly for the US dollar, the US has made more than one. So pretty much here he's saying that the world is starting to lose trust. And once trust is lost, it takes a very large act or a long time for that trust to be regained again. So for example, let's say that the US did lose the ability to have the US Federal Reserve note as the world reserve currency because of a lack of trust, okay, in the dollar. What would it take for the world to regain that trust? Well, it may take one or more things. I mean, let's say the US turned around and said, okay, we're going to go ahead and back our dollar 100% by gold. That may help, but it may not. It just depends. Geopolitics, you know, is multifaceted, I would say. You know, it's not just one thing that you can do. Regarding this, it is essential to understand that maybe nothing is as important for predicting the long-term consequences of U.S. foreign and economic policies as the following common sense rule. The main problem of being the leader is that you are graded accordingly. Common standards are not enough. You need to use stricter standards, and to be a good leader, you always need to listen to the opinion of others, particularly when it is a majoritarian opinion. But the U.S. seems to forget this too frequently. Its economy seems to rely each time more on speculation and less on regulation. It makes it a prone to bubbles economy. Speculation born from deregulation may be good for sudden bursts of profits, but it is lousy for stability, and nothing is more important for a reserve currency than stability. Simply put, the U.S. cannot have both the pie and the dime. Nobody wants to be poor because the most affluent neighbor convinced everyone in the community to keep their savings in the safe room of his house, and then decided to put a gas station in front and choose to pass tubes through the same wall where the chimney is. So responsible behavior is the bare minimum standard that a global leader must fulfill. And world opinion about U.S. capabilities in this regard has changed a lot in the last 30 years. After the end of the Cold War, the U.S. had amassed a considerable amount of political capital in the form of international goodwill. After all, it had become the sole superpower left without recurring to a major war with the USSR, and it had led its allies to what had been largely a peaceful victory against their adversaries. Furthermore, there was a worldwide sigh of relief after finally leaving behind the nightmarish possibility of nuclear war between both blocs. But in the last 2 decades, all that goodwill has been eroding slowly because the U.S. has taken decisions against the opinion of the majority that cost very expensive events for global community and brought pain to millions of people both overseas and in the U.S. All these events have added pressure onto the question of the U.S. aptitude as global leader. And I'm wondering what these events were. I think I already know, but we'll read on. 3 events caused by U.S. decisions stand out. The first was the invasion of Iraq against the majoritarian global opinion and the formal protests of 54 countries, including many close allies of the U.S., among them Canada, Mexico, Germany, and France. Not just because most countries considered that a preemptive invasion was against international law and created a dangerous precedent, but because several governments believed it could only destabilize more the Middle East, like indeed happened later. And as far as I'm concerned, that was the major goal of the Iraq invasion and all that stuff that's going on there now, is because they want to destabilize the Middle East. So they want control over that area. The second, the U.S. housing bubble of 2007 and 8, which caused a global recession, despite the fact that it would have been entirely avoidable with responsible regulation, and well before the bubble burst, several respected experts had warned that the situation was becoming unsustainable. Okay? The third, quite simply, the election of a president whose main policy is called America First. Oh, goodness. And that's all they have to say, that. This third self-inflicted strike against the prestige of the U.S. as a responsible world leader deserves more analysis, because it is exactly the moment when we are now. So the first obvious question is, how can any person or country be a leader if he declares that he will always put his own interests first? Then the group's interests, his interests first, and the group's interests, and he also acts that way. Unsurprisingly, this has been causing a swift and complete reversion in global opinion regarding the U.S. I'm not going to get political. I'm not going to get into this. All right, I'll read the I have my own opinions on, you know, putting America first and all that kind of stuff. And pretty much, you know, and I'll put it out there. I think that as long as a country does the right thing by its people, okay, because that's what the government is there for. The government is supposed to protect your rights, all right, and it's supposed to guard the nation against outside invaders. That's it. They're not supposed to be there to wipe your nose, you know, if you have a cold. They're not supposed to be there to give you other people's stuff. They're supposed to be there to protect your rights, protect your liberties, all right? So, for example, if I step on your toe and you lose your nail and you want to sue me because I damaged your private property, which was your toe, you can sue me and take me to court. That is one of the ways, and then the courts will arbitrate whether I'm right and you're wrong, or whether you're right and I'm wrong, and decide what actions to take afterward. Okay, that's putting it as simple as I can. Okay, I think that as long as a government does what they're supposed to do for their people, that everything else will work out. All right, everything else will work out. But I don't agree that our government is supposed to be here for another government or for another country. Okay, you let the free market work, everything will work itself out eventually, because the free market always works itself out a lot more efficiently and effectively than government does. But that's, of course, my opinion. Most of the world community considers that a sensible leadership in the U.S. is a necessity, because nobody sane wants another major conflict among big powers. This was one of the main reasons why Barack Obama was received so well by most of the world. I think that the main reason Barack Obama was received so well by the rest of the world is because he was taking our standard of living and bringing it down to the mean of the world. All right, ladies and gentlemen, check this out. More than half of the world lives on less than $5 a day. And the ideology behind the previous administration was that instead of trying to pick up the rest of the world and pick ourselves up as well, what we would do is we would find that mean with the world. All right, so we weren't going to prosper. The rest of the world was going to prosper as we were diminished. Okay, that's what global governance does, is it tries to put the entire world in one pot. All right, and I don't agree with that. Instead of trying to bring something down to pick something else up, you should be trying to bring both up, not trying to bring something down. I.e., for example, look at all the manufacturing jobs that we've lost that have gone to other countries. All right, has it made the economies in those countries better? Yep, it made their economies better. It made our economy worse. All right, did we still have a better standard of living than those other poor countries? Yeah, our standard of living was still better, but it was worse than it was before. But it's still better than those poor countries. You know, those other countries, their standard of living went up by us getting rid of all of our manufacturing plants. Their standard of living went up, so they were able to live a little bit better than they did before. But our standard of living went down. So what globalism does is that it tries to even the playing field and have everyone in the world, you know, having around the same standard of living. And what would that mean for us? Okay, I think that if you earn something, you should keep it. You shouldn't be made to give it to anyone else. And that's the same thing that was going on with our jobs going to different countries. All right, it was trying, every time that the previous administration said that they were just trying to even the playing field, what they meant was that they're trying to make other countries' standard of living go up. All right, but they never mentioned that in order for that to happen, our standard of living had to go down. And that's how I feel about that. Any comments on that? Keep it classy, okay? Let's go on. Let's go on to the next one here. pretty much here he's just bashing the administration, so I'm not going to keep it political. I don't like that. All right, let's see. U.S. dollar and U.S. politics. Yeah. All right, we'll read a little bit here. I hate making it political because some people will read into it and just think that they'll go off on a 3-chapter rant, you know, about politics. And as far as I'm concerned, politics is the devil. U.S. dollar and U.S. politics, okay, are deeply linked, and that's true. Anyone interested on currencies who does not see that it is not doing his or her homework. Like the New York Times reported recently, since the beginning of this year, the dollar has surrendered nearly 8% against a basket of major currencies. And when the dollar loses value, all the countries' savings in dollars also lose part of their accumulated wealth, which understandably does not make them happy. Actually, I disagree with that. When the dollar loses value, I think it's easier for other countries, all right, for a simple reason, because it takes less of their currency to purchase dollars, and they need dollars to trade worldwide. So when the dollar loses value, it takes let's talk, for example, India. The less valuable the dollar is, the less rupees that it takes to buy a dollar. And if India needs dollars in their reserves to buy oil or whatever other things that they get from international trade, the easier that it is going to be for them to buy dollars when the dollar is valued less. And the easier that it will be for the government of India or corporations in India that borrowed US dollars, the easier that it will be for them to pay back those US dollars. So, I mean, I'm not an economic expert, but I don't agree with that right there, that the higher the dollar goes, the worse it is for other countries. Because also, if the dollar gets so high where India can't buy something from the US, then that's bad for the US, because we can't export that something to India because they can't afford to buy it. So, but, you know, and if the dollar gets so high, India won't even be able to afford to buy our stuff, and they won't even be able to afford to pay back loans that they took out in dollars. So a lot of people think that a high dollar is a good thing for other countries. I don't think that the high dollar is good for other countries. In a way, it's good for us because we can import things at a lower cost to us, all right? But then it's really not that great for our corporations and companies because it's more difficult for us to export things because they are now more expensive. Okay, but the world's worries, particularly by U.S. allies, with the turn that the U.S. economy is taking, go beyond the dollar itself. Though they don't forget it, like a recent internal position paper from the Economist and Financial Committee of the European Union reveals. As Stanley Fischer, who recently resigned to his post as vice chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve, says, "I had a picture of the world economy in which the United States was an anchor, not a source of volatility." And that's true. We are a source of volatility. Fisher previously was chief economist of the World Bank, deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund, and governor of the Bank of Israel. So he seems pretty qualified to explain the current world economic system. Fisher says the system needs a hegemon. It was Britain for a long time, and I disagree with this, but I'll read it again. He says the system needs a hegemon. It was Britain for a long time. It moved to the U.S. fairly quickly. We are left with a world that doesn't have an anchor country or a hegemon or whatever you want to call it, unless things change in the U.S. What he's saying that the world needs a world reserve currency. You know, I don't think it does need a world reserve currency. What's wrong with honest money? The world reserve currency should be gold. You know, and when I say gold, I mean it should be something that's honest. It should be honest money. Something that you can't create out of thin air. Okay? something something where you can only use it as an in and out entry. Okay, you can only have an in entry on your ledger and an out entry, coming in and going out. That's all you can do. That's honest money. All right, something you can't print out of thin air, and something that you can only add to a ledger and deduct from a ledger, not just keep adding and adding and adding, you know, and making as much of it as you want. Fisher's comments about the system needs a hegemon also help to explain why. Despite all of the former, as long as the U.S. avoids the roulette of a new major conflict with other powers, and unless the U.S. government makes a really stupid and irresponsible move, like defaulting on its debt or refinancing it, which would probably cause a global depression, we're not going to have a choice, making the dollar lose any status as a safe currency. I mean, it's already lost that status, and I know this article is about a year old, so the US dollar will be the main global currency for quite a few more years, probably even for several decades. Simply put, the costs, risks, and difficulties of replacing the US dollar as global currency are too large to make that move suddenly. In fact, none of the three economies that handle half of the global GDP can afford to suddenly fall off the dollar, caused by a massive sale of currency. Oh, so he's pretty much saying that the people that hold the most U.S. debt, they're not going to go ahead and just sell off their debt, you know, because it would be really bad if China just put $1 trillion worth of U.S. bonds out there for sale, or treasuries out there for sale. And if all the three fall, there will be not easy or fast replacement. Okay. However, I believe that eventually the US dollar will lose its status as main global currency. For the reasons already described, it may not happen soon, and hopefully not suddenly, because everyone would lose in that way. But it will happen, and current events may accelerate a change in that motion. In fact, several countries already use their national currencies when trading with certain partners, avoiding the need of buying US dollars for bilateral trade. And some states with economies particularly tied to the US dollar are starting to use their own digital currencies as a way to be less dependent. Nevertheless, I don't believe that the US dollar will be replaced just by another national currency, because we seem to be going into a direction of a multipolar world, and it seems logical that the next system shows this reality. Besides, it will not happen so much due to the economical accession of any given country to the top of the world's economy, but mostly because the current system is too sensitive to irresponsible behaviors, and this creates unacceptable and unnecessary risks for all involved. So I think the US dollar will be replaced by an international currency, probably derived from a vast the SDR. That's the SDR, ladies and gentlemen, is just another fiat currency. It's just another currency printed out of thin air by the IMF. Okay, probably derived from a basket of several national currencies. Maybe the perfect version of the SDR related proposal already in development, or perhaps a super currency like the one proposed by Justin G. Fulin, former chief economist of the World Bank. World Bank, ladies and gentlemen. The SDR, if the SDR becomes the world reserve currency, it means that the IMF will pretty much have the same powers that the U.S. has now over the world's economy with the U.S. dollar. They will have that over the entire world, including the U.S. I believe that if the SDR becomes the world reserve currency, we will very, very much likely lose our sovereignty. You know, it may take a generation or two, but we as a nation will lose our sovereignty. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stop reading because this article is a bit more longer. Okay, but probably another 5 or 10 minutes of reading. All right, but this is my lunchtime right now, so I'm going to go ahead and stop reading. If you guys want to finish reading this article, which I recommend that you do, I'm going to leave the link, okay, in the description. So let me go ahead and take off, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining me today. I hope that you're having a good time chatting away. So we will go ahead and talk to you guys tomorrow. Remember that the Twilight Zone will be premiering at 8 a.m. Alaska time on Saturday, and the Sunday Q&A, where we are going to give away the 3 prepper item bundle, all right, to a lucky subscriber, will be at the same time. Will be premiering at 8 a.m. Sunday morning, okay, Alaska time. All right, so we hope that I'll see a lot of you guys there. And having said that, remember to be good to each other. I hope you guys had a great week. It's Friday, thank goodness. When good people do good things happen. Remember to reach one, teach one, and repeat. If we all did this, the world would be a better place, and you know that it will be a better place. Many blessings to all of you and your families. This is Alaska Prepper, and I'm out.